Hi, with Julian on the Brown Note, and the first post of the year. Been a while. I took some time off over Christmas, so it's a rather celebratory return with the death of Cardinal George Pell, at one point the third highest ranked member of the Catholic Church, the highest ranked member of the Catholic Church in Australia, and a man that was accused of and initially convicted of 5 counts of child sex abuse, but probably more awful was being the head of the Catholic Church through a period of rampant child sex abuse allegations that he was then accused of covering up and facilitating and doing what the Catholic Church did, which was move priests from one diocese to another to hide their abuse and knowing that they would carry on fiddling with children. He died yesterday, and people say don't speak ill of the dead. I don't buy that. I think that's, if someone's in a position of power, that's exactly when you should judge them. You don't say Margaret Thatcher died yesterday, let's all cry. You say, no, she was pure evil and she did enormous damage to the world. So everyone is now clamouring on this post-Brittany Higgins innocent until proven guilty rubbish, which they're now aiming at George Pell, saying that he was completely clear of any wrongdoing because of what happened in the trial, where he was eventually acquitted. And we'll look into that in a bit. And just ignoring the Royal Commission. So many people have come out in support of him, saying, he was acquitted. Well, he wasn't acquitted in the Royal Commission for his tenure of multiple years of being a person in charge in the Catholic Church who knew about child sex abuse and moved offenders around, and was dismissive and defending the church, even though there were people that had been abused by that church that he then did his best to facilitate the covering up of. Whereas the left are crucifying him, the right are out there celebrating. He's got an absolute rogues gallery of people supporting him, and they're all saying, this is a leftist takedown. Apparently the left care about child sex abuse. I'm guessing the right don't. It seems to be part of the right now. We care about women being raped and children being abused. Apparently these are leftist concerns now. And the left are out there calling him, a nonce, beast of Ballarat, a high-ranking kiddie fiddler. In fact, at one point, the highest-ranking kiddie fiddler on earth to have ever been convicted. Why he's been a hero for the right, and I'm going to do another piece after this, because the right have the worst group of superheroes in their history at the moment, and George Pell is a superhero to the right, and in the modern era, more often than not, that means that the right feel like the left are attacking him. But he also had a lot of conservative views on many issues, like he was against the ordination of women priests, very against abortion. I believe he said something charming along the lines of, abortion is worse than child sex abuse. Something, I'm paraphrasing, but something along those lines. He opposed action on climate change. This is a guy that was called a mentor by people like Tony Abbott, our previous Prime Minister. And then we've got Brian Houston, who was the head of the Hillsong Evangelical Church, being called a mentor to our last Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. I detect a theme here. But he was up there with very, very powerful conservative forces in the media as well. Andrew Bolt, Miranda Devine, these people worshipped him and defended him, even when he was convicted of child sex abuse. They defended him then. The funny thing about them saying about how, he was ultimately acquitted, therefore he was innocent. They supported him just as much through the year that he was in jail saying the same thing. It didn't matter that he had a guilty verdict, so don't turn around and say that it matters that the guilty verdict was overturned by the High Court, because you didn't change your tune when he was convicted either. He had hilarious views on climate change. So whilst Tony Abbott was out there and John Howard was out there, another man, our previous Prime Minister, our own Margaret Thatcher, worshipped George Pell. While Abbott and Howard were doing their best to stop Australia acting on climate change and putting us near the bottom of the ladder globally on action on climate change, Pell, who is somebody that celebrated the tax-free, non-political nature of the Catholic Church, was out there politically campaigning about things like climate change. I thought it was quite hilarious that he likened modern science on climate change to people making sacrifices to appease the gods. Now, is it scientists that are closer to that, or is it the church? He actually said along the lines of climate activism now is nothing different to people sacrificing animals to appease the weather gods. Yet he belongs to a church and he's talking about science. He was against divorce. Very, very hard line on sexuality and gay marriage. Homosexuality is worse than smoking. He was anti-condoms, if you can believe that. He said it was ridiculous that to think that a man-made device like a condom could stop AIDS, even though that is literally true. He believed abstinence would stop AIDS, which is proven to have not worked, whereas condoms have. He was against embryonic stem cell research, of course he was, and he was censured for campaigning on that by other Catholic. So you've got Catholic politicians like Christina Keneally who are much more progressive, and they butted heads. He was old school. He was male domination. He was part of that world. But they're defending a man who is up to his neck in child sex abuse. The trial that he was initially convicted in, I think it was two guys that came forward. He had 5 counts of child sex abuse against him, having fiddled with children. 5 counts, he was convicted by a jury. He went to a court of appeals and the judges upheld that verdict. 2 of the 3 judges in the court of appeals upheld the verdict, 1 dissented. So he went through a court of appeals, he was still guilty. No one on the right cared about any of that. He then went to the High Court. Now, isn't it nice that you've got such powerful friends, you can be convicted of child abuse twice and still get a third go at justice? The High Court then said that the initial trial and the appeals trial, on a technicality, had strayed from allowing the jury to consider that the events didn't occur. Not that he was innocent, but a technical part of the process of the first trial may not have been followed in the correct manner. So they dismissed all charges based on the technicality after he'd spent a year in jail. That isn't something I would be running around the block celebrating. In the middle of all this happening, there was a Royal Commission into child sex abuse, particularly focusing on the Anglican and Catholic churches. And we know that the Catholic Church, this is a spotlight era on the Catholic Church. We know that there is a historic problem of child sex abuse in organisations like the Anglican Church, like others organisations, but probably the number one globally has been the Catholic Church. And I think, and so do others, that their idea on priests abstaining from sex and not having normal sexual relationships and, leaving the priesthood at the age of 27 with the mentality of a 12-year-old boy, and probably having been through some form of abuse by that stage themselves, leads to, I think the Catholic Church's own figures is something like 6% of their priests globally, in the thousands, are likely to have committed child sex offences. Any organisation on earth that had 6% of its staff were child sex offenders would probably have been shut down by now. But for me, the fact that they allow men to develop unnaturally, there is no reason for them to abstain from normal sexual relations. They say that these things are from God. Get married, have children is from God. You can't do that. There has never been a reason. And more we understand that stumping people's development like this leads to a far higher likelihood. And the other thing is, they cover stuff up so much. There's so much shame and guilt associated with Catholicism that people do things in secret. They're used to shame and guilt and absolution and going and doing their confession. This isn't a healthy environment. So the Royal Commission was actually, the verdict on George Pell's conduct while he was leading the church in Australia was held up for years because he was being investigated for abusing children himself. So the findings were made in 2017, but they were released in May 2020 because they were withheld while Pell's own sexual abuse case was ongoing. They concluded Pell knew of child sex abuse by the clergy in the 1970s but didn't take adequate action to address it. They're accusing this man of knowing about child sex abuse from a position of power for 30 years before this all sort of came to a head. In the case of Gerald Ridsdale, the most famous clergyman in Australia to have abused children, while Pell was a priest in the suburb of Ballarat, the Commission concluded in 1973 Father Pell turned his mind to the prudence of Ridsdale taking boys to overnight camps with child sex abuse on his radar. And the Commission concluded by 73 Cardinal Pell was not only conscious of child sexual abuse by the clergy, he considered measures of avoiding situations which might provoke gossip about child sex abuse that was actually happening. This is who the right are defending. Someone that is, by a Royal Commission's own findings, had been in some way covering up child sex abuse since 1973, who had roomed with the most prominent clergyman to have been accused of child sex abuse, Ridsdale, over, I think, 70 different cases, and they said that's touching the tip of the iceberg. For the case of Father Peter Searson, whilst Pell was an auxiliary bishop in Melbourne, the Commission concluded, given the information that Pell had in 1989, he should have advised the Archbishop to remove Father Searson. He did not do so because he knew he was a child sex offender. Pell told the Commission he received a list of grievances about Searson, including statements, Searson had harassed children, used children's toilets without cause, shown children a dead body, and practiced animal cruelty. The Commission concluded that it ought to have been obvious to Pell that he needed to have Searson removed. Pell removed Searson in 1997, 8 years later. And for the case of Father Wilfred James Baker, while Pell was the Archbishop of Melbourne, the Commission concluded Pell had the power to remove Baker in 1996 when he learnt that Baker was about to be charged. But he didn't, resulting in Baker continuing as a priest at a primary school. 2 years later, Baker was jailed for child sex abuse. At the very least, Pell has covered up child sex abuse and known very well some of the worst perpetrators. That last one, he had the power to remove him in 1996 when he knew that Baker was going to be charged with child sex offences. He didn't, allowing him to be a parish priest with a primary school of primary school aged children, and 2 years later he's jailed for child sex abuse. This is who the right are trying to maintain is someone the left attacked. The left did not make him cover up child sex abuse for decades. Absolute garbage. This is who you're defending. And I think there's this really weird Venn diagram at the moment. There's this like parallel of people that have spent the last 10 years going on about this secret cabal of child sex traffickers around the world, led by Epstein and the Clintons. A lot of these people are defending George Pell. It's absolutely amazing. The people that have come out in support of Pell are the rogues gallery of some of the worst politicians Australia's ever produced and some of the worst journalists. Corey Bernardi, Tony Abbott, Joe Hockey, John Howard, journalists like Miranda Devine and Andrew Bolt. They regard it as a culture war. They regard any approbation of George Pell and the Catholic Church to be this culture war from the left against the right. Apparently, being upset against children being sexually abused is left wing. I guess that makes me a lefty. So up yours, George Pell. I hope you rot in hell.